Hi, everyone. Give you a moment to quiet down and get settled. Thank you. Welcome to the workshop for making your initial commitments in the broadcast incentive auction. We're going to start off with some introductory remarks by Gary Epstein, the chair of the Incentive Auction Task Force. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Good morning. Welcome to the Incentive Auction Initial Commitments Workshop. As many of you will recall, when Chairman Wheeler started counting down the days until the auction begins, we were exactly 200 days away. As of 10 a.m. this morning, we're 18 days and 8 hours until the close of the reverse auction initial commitment window at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on March 29th. Today I want to provide some context and very briefly talk about three things before I turn the meeting over to our expert auction team. First, I want to reiterate and assure you that from now up to and including 6 p.m. on March 29th, our focus is on getting you all of the information and tools you need to successfully make your initial bid commitment. Second, I want to briefly discuss what comes next after March 29th to get you ready for the reverse auction bidding. And finally, I want to spend a minute updating everyone on post-auction transition. Today's workshop is another important step in the pre-auction planning that began in the fall with the release of the opening bid prices and the application procedures PN, and continued this winter with the reverse auction application workshop and then the actual reverse and forward application filing windows. That process went well, and both sets of applications are now before us. Today's initial commitment workshop is a companion to the interactive tutorial and user guide we released on the Auction 1000 webpage on February 29th. The webpage and tutorials are there for you to review and re-review at your convenience. They're designed so that all applicants will be well prepared to make their initial commitments. Well, our team today will take you for a brief tour under the hood to help explain your upcoming choices. You will see the system is easy to use, and for most bidders, the process to finalize an initial commitment for a station can be completed in minutes. Today's workshop, along with subsequent Q&As, will also be available online within the next few days. Next week, we'll issue a public notice informing applicants that they will individually receive their second confidential letters, which will include the status of their application and stations. If your application has been deemed complete, your package will also contain registration materials and the RSA tokens needed to log into the bidding system. Next, as we've already announced, you will have the opportunity to log into the initial commitment system 5 days early at 10 a.m. on March 24th to practice using your token and see your stations listed. Log in early to take advantage of this preview practice window. Our help desk will be open and fully staffed during both the preview and commitment windows to make sure that you have access to personalized assistance if you need it. It's a complete package. Our written procedures PN, opening bid prices, interactive tutorial, user guide, this workshop, a professional help desk, and early login are all designed to make the commitment window easy for broadcasters. Also, prior to March 29th, likely within the next 10 days, we plan to release the forward auction status public notice that will let everyone know which companies have applied to participate in the forward auction and the status of their applications. So after 6 p.m. on the 29th, then what? The next step is to continue our information and education outreach, focusing on the reverse auction bidding or clock phase of the auction. We'll conclude this workshop today with a brief overview of the interface that you'll be using to bid in the reverse auction bidding system. We'll repeat the education and information process for the clock phase. This again will include an interactive tutorial, user guide, and another workshop like this to walk you through the bidding process in detail. As promised, qualified reverse auction bidders will be able to participate in a mock auction using the reverse auction bidding system so everyone can get comfortable with it before the bidding begins. Finally, a word about post-auction transition. Last week, Chairman Wheeler told Congress that the task force model has worked well, and he intends to keep it in place to manage the post-auction broadcast transition. In reality, we've been working on post-auction transition for several years, and we've now pivoted to focus on getting the repacking schedule and reimbursement process in place. We're right now building a more complete record on the repack process and schedule, and there have been several studies and thoughtful recommendations submitted in that record. We'd like to hear your insights. What data can you provide to inform our decision making? We thank those of you who have already made comments or presentations. Now's the time for everyone to step up. In a minute, we're going to introduce Erin Griffith, who in addition to representing the auctions division of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, has recently been named as legal advisor to the Incentive Auction Task Force. At the same time, if you'll indulge me for a minute, Erin succeeds, not replaces, our friend and colleague Mary Margaret Jackson, who's leaving both the Commission and the District of Columbia, along with her family, to pursue an exciting new chapter in their lives. Mary Margaret, thanks for your public service to the task force and to the Commission. We'll miss you, and Erin, welcome to the task force. Let me also say a few words about the incredible FCC team that got us here for today's workshop. Dozens of talented people are directly responsible. A special thanks to Margie Wiener and the WTB's auction division, and to our presenters, Melissa Dumford, Director of Systems and Optimizations for the Task Force, John McCormick, Attorney Advisor and Information Systems Specialist for the Task Force, and Vice Chair Howard Simons, who will moderate the Q&A session and, of course, answer all the hard questions themselves. Back to Craig for a minute.
Thanks, Gary. I wanted to give an update to people who are watching this live online. You're going to see the presentation video stream to you. We will also have the slides available for you to download, so if that works better for you to follow along, you may do that. Last I checked 2 minutes ago, they weren't on the web yet, but they will be there soon, and we will try to give you an update when they are available. Thank you. Erin?
Thank you, Gary and Craig. So, good morning. Before we get going and really, get into the details of the presentation, it is my job to remind you that this workshop is meant as a supplemental training tool, and it is not intended to supersede any of the Commission's rules or public notices. Applicants should familiarize themselves with the relevant rules, orders, and public notices, and additionally, all of the examples that we will use in today's presentation are meant only for illustrative purposes. So, there you go. Regarding questions, we will have time, as Gary mentioned, later in this workshop to answer questions. If you're here in person, please go ahead and write the questions on the forms that were provided to you. There are extra copies at the registration table. We will collect those forms during the break. If you're watching this live, you can email questions to auctions1001@fcc.gov. And if you are watching this recorded version, once it's been posted online, you can continue to email questions to that address and we will answer them. As we go through the information today, I want you to keep in mind that this workshop can really be broken down into 4 basic goals. First, we want you to be familiar with the steps that will take place between today and the first round of bidding in the clock phase. Second, we want you to understand the options that are available for an applicant to commit to during the initial commitment window. Third, we want applicants to be prepared to make initial commitments, so we will walk you through the initial commitment bidding software. And fourth, we will explain the implications of committing to the different options. And finally, we will provide you with some bonus information. Namely, we are going to give you a sneak peek at the reverse auction bidding system, which will be used when we actually get to the clock rounds. Before I discuss what is coming next, let's take a second and review where we are. Applicants submitted applications to participate in the reverse auction. Commission staff reviewed the applications and sent the first confidential status letter to each applicant, informing the applicant about the completeness of its application and stations. We had a resubmission period, during which time the applicants were permitted to correct deficiencies in their applications, if there were any. And the next step in the process then is the, as Gary mentioned, second confidential status letter. Every applicant that submitted a FCC Form 177 will receive a second confidential status letter. This means even if an application was deemed complete in the first letter, you will get a second letter. The letter will be mailed to the contact person listed in the Form 177. And although the contact person does not have to physically be the person that signs, a delivery signature will be required in order for the packet or for the letter to be received. If the application is deemed complete in the second status letter, an applicant may make an initial commitment for each station that is also deemed complete in that letter. Finally, if the application is deemed complete, the second status letter will contain RSA tokens, as Gary mentioned. An applicant's authorized bidder must have an RSA token in order to make an initial commitment. Throughout this process, we will refer to participating stations. When we use that term, we mean a station that was selected on an applicant's Form 177 that is deemed complete and is thus eligible to have an initial commitment made for that station. The next step is going to be the initial commitment preview period. The preview period begins at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, March 24th, and continues until the initial commitment window opens on March 28th. Once that window opens, applicants may actually make an initial commitment. The preview period provides the applicants with the opportunity to log into the system and see information about their stations, and we strongly encourage applicants to log in during the preview period. Next, the initial commitment window will open at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Monday, March 28th. It will remain open for applicants to make initial commitments until the deadline at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, March 29th. Commitments must be made prior to the 6 p.m. deadline. Late commitments will not be accepted. An applicant that fails to commit to an initial relinquishment option for a station will not be qualified to bid in the clock phase for that station. We're going to pause on the initial commitment step now to do a deeper dive. But before we demonstrate the initial commitment bidding software, I'm going to review a few basic concepts. Specifically, I am going to review the relinquishment options, remind you that the VHF bands have limited capacity and why that matters, explain what an initial commitment is and how we will use it, and finally, I will go over the options that are available for applicants to commit to during the initial commitment window. You may recall that there are 3 possible relinquishment options in this auction. Today, we are going to use the image of a box to represent each relinquishment option. The first relinquishment option is go off air. Bidders that bid to go off air may either relinquish their spectrum usage rights and exit broadcasting, or relinquish those rights to share a channel with another station post-auction. This go off air box, if you will, is the largest box by far. What I mean by that is that the auction system has an unlimited capacity to assign stations to go off the air. Remember, if an applicant's bid to go off the air is accepted in the auction and it becomes a winning bidder, the bidder will relinquish its 6 MHz channel for that station, and the station will not need to be repacked. The second relinquishment option is to move to the low VHF band. If a bidder becomes a winning bidder in the auction to move to low VHF band, or bidding to move to the low VHF band, that bidder will relinquish its channel in its pre-auction band and will be given a new channel in the low VHF band. Finally, the third relinquishment option is a move to the high VHF band. Again, if a bidder becomes a winning bidder bidding to move to high VHF, it will relinquish its channel in its pre-auction band and be given a new channel in the high VHF band. You'll notice that the boxes representing the VHF options are much smaller than the off-air box. Since space is limited in the VHF bands, only a limited number of stations can ultimately be assigned to move to those bands. Now that we've reviewed the relinquishment options and I've reminded you that the VHF bands do have limited capacity, we're going to talk about what an initial commitment is and how the auction system will use it. By making an initial commitment, an applicant is committing to relinquish the relevant spectrum usage rights for a station in exchange for the opening price option, in exchange for the opening price for the option or options that it, that it selects. For the option or options that it selects during the initial commitment window, should that station be frozen at its opening price for one of its selected options. In other words, if an applicant commits to an option for a station during this window, it should understand that the system may assign the station to that option, and it is possible that the station will ultimately relinquish the spectrum usage rights for that station for that option at the opening price. Only applicants whose Form 177s were deemed complete in the second confidential status letter may make an initial commitment, and only for stations that are also deemed complete. Now that we've reviewed what an initial commitment is, let's talk briefly about how the auction system uses initial commitments. Here we see a simple depiction of all the broadcast stations in their pre-auction bands. A number of them apply to participate in the auction and commit to an initial relinquishment option. Every broadcast station participating in the auction must be assigned to an initial option before the clock phase of the auction can begin, either to go off air, move to low VHF, move to high VHF, or they must be designated to be repacked in their pre-auction band. This means that, for instance, this group of stations that committed to an option during the initial commitment window must be assigned to an option before the clock phase can start, which would end up looking something like this. So, how does the auction system know which stations are going to be assigned to which options? That's where the initial commitment comes in. The auction system will ultimately use the options that an applicant commits to in order to set the initial clearing target for the incentive auction and to assign each station to an option at the beginning of the auction. The next logical question is, well, which relinquishment options can an applicant make a commitment to? And how does the auction system determine which of those options you're ultimately going to be assigned to? I am going to cover which options an applicant may commit to. Later in the presentation, my colleague Melissa will unravel for you how those commitments get turned into the initial option that a station will be assigned to at the start of the auction. So, an applicant that selected all of the available options, an applicant that selected all of the available options on its Form 177 for a UHF station will have the option of committing to go off the air, move to low VHF, or move to high VHF during the initial commitment window. An applicant that selected all of the available options on its Form 177 for a high VHF station can commit to go off the air and or move to low VHF during the initial commitment window. An applicant that selected a low VHF station on its Form 177 can commit to go off the air. This is the only option available to a low VHF station, therefore the only option that is available for it to commit to. As we just saw, many applicants have several relinquishment options that may be available to their stations. The initial commitment is where the applicant selects which option or options it is willing to commit to and which of its available options is its preferred option. An applicant must commit to a preferred option in order to become qualified to bid for that station in the reverse auction clock phase. An applicant's preferred option is the relinquishment option that the applicant would most prefer to be assigned to at the beginning of round 1 of the clock phase. If an applicant does not commit to a preferred option for each of its stations prior to the 6 p.m. deadline on March 29th, that station will not become qualified to bid in the clock phase. If an applicant would most prefer to move to low VHF or move to high VHF in the first round of the auction, the applicant may also commit to one or more fallbacks. A fallback option is a relinquishment option that an applicant would like the auction system to consider assigning the station to if the auction system cannot accommodate the preferred option. If an applicant selects a fallback option, it is making a binding commitment to relinquish the associated spectrum usage rights for the opening price for that option in the event that the station is assigned to that fallback option and is frozen at the opening price. Remember how we earlier discussed that there is limited capacity in the VHF bands. Because the auction system may not be able to fit every station that prefers to move to low VHF or move to high VHF in those bands, and we want as many stations as possible to be able to participate in the clock phase if they would like to, the system gives such applicants the option of committing to these additional relinquishment or fallback options. The system will only consider a fallback option if the applicant's preferred option cannot be accommodated. And as we discussed a moment ago, using the initial commitments made by the applicants, the auction system will determine an initial option for each participating station. The initial option is the relinquishment option assigned to a station at the start of the reverse auction clock rounds. The initial option will always be one of the initial commitments that was made for that station, whether it is a preferred or fallback option, if that's applicable. Now, I just went over a lot of definitions and words, so let's take a moment and go through an example of what it would look like if stations are making initial commitments. First, let's say that the applicants for this group of station prefers to go off the air as their preferred option. This means that at the start of round 1 of the clock phase, go off air is the relinquishment option that this group of applicants would most prefer the station to be assigned to. Next, let's say that the applicants for this group of stations most prefer that the station be assigned to move to the low VHF band. Because the low VHF band has limited capacity, meaning it is possible that not all stations that prefer to move to low VHF may be able to fit in low VHF, the applicants for this group of stations may also commit to fallback options. So, in this case, the applicant for the UHF station here that prefers to move to low VHF has committed to 2 fallback options: go off the air and move to high VHF. So as you can see, this applicant is utilizing its ability to commit to all 3 of the options it selected on its form. 1 is a preferred and 2 is fallbacks. The second applicant here, UHF station, has declined to make any fallback options, which is also something that it is allowed to do. It does not have to commit to more than 1. You only have to commit to the options that you are willing to consider. Finally, let's say that the applicants for this group of stations most prefer that the station be assigned to move to the high VHF band at the start of the auction. Again, because there is limited capacity in the high VHF band, these applicants may not be able to be assigned to the high VHF to move to the high VHF band. So they may select fallback options. Here, one of the stations selects a fallback of go off air. One selects both go off air and move to the low VHF band. One selects only move to the low VHF band, and one declines to make any fallback bids. So as you can see, again, these stations are utilizing and committing to the various options that were available to them if they selected those options on their form. In this example also, the stations remaining at the top there are ones that either are not participating in the auction or ones that did not make an initial commitment. Those stations will be designated to be repacked in their pre-auction bands. So, now that we've reviewed what the relinquishment options are, discussed the capacity of the VHF band, explained what an initial commitment is, and gone over the options that are available for applicants to commit to during the initial commitment window, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Jonathan McCormick, and he is actually going to walk you through what the bidding screens look like for the initial commitment system. Jonathan?
Thanks, Erin. Now, that may have seemed somewhat complicated to people, I don't know, but it's actually quite easy in the software. All right, so as Erin mentioned, the software will actually the system will become available for preview periods starting at 10 a.m. on Thursday, March 24th. Once the system becomes available, it can actually be accessed by clicking on a link on the main auction homepage. And, the details for how to log in, URL, that will be included for applicants who have applications deemed complete in their second confidential status letter. So all users that are wanting to make an initial commitment must first log in to access the system. Applicants will receive their username and token for each authorized bidder indicated on the Form 177. And here we'll show the process to log in as an authorized bidder for an applicant. All fields are required to log in. And please note that when you're first logging in, if you haven't logged in before, you'll actually leave the PIN field blank and go through a process to set up a new PIN. We're not going to go through that. It's in the user guide. It's not that difficult. And if you run into any issues logging in, please reach out to the technical support team during the preview period, during the initial commitment window. They should be able to help you with that. And as the lawyers have reminded me, please remember that each RSA token used to log in may only be used by a specific person with the person's FCC-supplied username. And in order to make initial commitments and bid for stations, an authorized bidder must use the specific token provided by the FCC and its associated username, as well as the password and for the FRN used on the applicant's Form 177. Please use the preview period to confirm that each person who is an authorized bidder has the correct token and knows which token is associated with which application and stations. Remember to safeguard your tokens. If we have to replace it or assign a new user, it's somewhat of a time-consuming process, so please make sure that you hold on to these things. All right, so you guys may have seen this if you've already seen the initial commitment tutorial video. We went through some of this stuff. I'll be going into a little bit more detail here. But upon logging in, users navigate through the auction system by clicking on links in the left-hand side. As you see, there's sort of a left menu bar there. For the initial commitment, a user will be able to navigate to 3 different screens in the auction system. Make commitment, where users will be able to commit to an initial relinquishment option for their stations. Messages, where users can view announcements and send messages to the FCC. And station info, where users can view static information about their stations for which they submitted an application that was deemed complete. The system will also display the name of the authorized individual logged in and allow the user to log out, lock their screen. Fairly self-explanatory. And on every page, the system will also display the name of the applicant and their FRN, the current stage, here it's the initial commitment window, but sort of a stage, the current time and date, and a countdown timer. Before the initial commitment window opens, the countdown timer will display the time until the initial commitment window opens. And then once the initial commitment window is opened, it will show the amount of time remaining until the window closes at 6 p.m. on March 29th. Users with applications deemed complete will be able to log in and access the system using the system during the preview period, starting at 10 a.m. on Thursday, March 24th. And during this preview period, users can familiarize themselves with the system. They'll be able to access both the messages, you can see here, and the station info screen. However, please note that until the window opens, the Make Commitment screen, you'll just see this message here. You can't actually access it and do anything until that window opens. Again, that's 10 a.m., March 28th, Monday morning, March 28th. So keep that in mind. So let's go a little bit deeper into this. Users will be able to access the Messages screen, again, during the preview period and also during the initial commitment window, in order to view announcements sent by the FCC or compose a private message to send to the FCC. To send a message to the FCC, users can click on a Compose New Message button, which will take them to a new message screen. On this screen, a user can enter a subject and message, and then click on the Send button in order to send a message to the FCC. It's pretty straightforward. Users will also see on their screen an unread message count next to the Messages link on every screen. From the Messages screen, users will also be able to read announcements by clicking on the View Entire Announcement link, which, once you've clicked it and read it, will mark that message as read and decrement the unread message count. Again, during the preview period and during the initial commitment window, you'll be able to access the station info screen in order to view some information about each of the stations that has an application deemed complete. Please note that the information on this screen does not change throughout the reverse auction. In this example, this user submitted an application for one station that was deemed complete. When the window opens, it will be able to make an initial commitment for this station. On the station info screen, users will be able to see the relinquishment options selected on its form for that station, as well as the opening prices for each option. Please note that if you go to the top, there's a little print screen link that you can print the screen for your records. Once the initial commitment window opens, users may submit their initial commitments on the Make Commitment screen as shown here. For each station, a user can choose to commit to its preferred relinquishment option from the drop-down menu. A user can choose from any relinquishment option selected on its Form 177 for that station. Alternatively, if the user no longer wants to bid for a station in the clock phase of the reverse auction, it can choose to decline to commit to any option. If a user declines to commit to an option for a station, that station will not participate in the clock phase of the reverse auction and will instead be designated for repacking in its pre-auction band. Once a user has chosen its preferred relinquishment option for a station, it must click on the Submit button in order to complete its initial commitment. Please note that if a user does not submit its initial commitment by the close of the initial commitment window, that station will not participate in the clock phase of the reverse auction. It's treated as if you've declined all of your commitment, declined to commit to anything. For each station, the system will display a green check mark and provide the time and date of the submission for a successfully submitted initial commitment. And users can also print a screen by clicking on the print screen link as a confirmation of its submissions. As a note, users should print a copy once all commitments have been submitted for your records, because after the window closes, this screen will become unavailable and users will no longer be able to print a confirmation of their submissions. So this is your chance to do that. At any point, while the initial commitment window remains open, users may modify submitted commitments for each station by clicking on the Change button. When modifying a submitted commitment, a user can choose from the drop-down menu its new preferred relinquishment option for that station. Once a user has chosen its new preferred relinquishment option, it must once again click on the Submit button for any modifications to take effect. Please note that until the user submits this modification, the previously submitted bid will remain submitted in the system. So if you decided ultimately, after selecting to go off air, that you want to decline your commitments, please make sure to submit that, or else it will not take effect. So far, we've seen how to commit to an option that can always be accommodated by the system. But as my colleague Aaron was mentioning, there's a whole lot of situations if you're trying to move to one of the VHF bands where that might not be necessarily the case. So in this case, if a user selects as his preferred relinquishment option to move to low VHF or to move to high VHF, and the station had more than one bid option available to it, and selected it on its application, the user must make a fallback option selection. Here's what it looks like. A fallback option will be considered if the auction system is unable to accommodate the user's preferred relinquishment option for a station. Please note that because the auction system is always able to accommodate an off-air relinquishment, a user that wishes to ensure that his station will be able to participate in the clock phase of the reverse auction should choose as either its preferred option or at least as a fallback the option to go off-air in the system. A user can select as its fallback option either one or both of the relinquishment options if it's available for that station. And a user that does not wish to commit to any option except for its preferred option can decline all fallbacks. In this case, if the auction system cannot accommodate your preferred option for the station, that station will not participate in the clock phase of the reverse auction and, as mentioned before, will be designated for repacking in its pre-auction band. Before a user can submit its commitment for a station whose preferred option may not be accommodated, in other words, if you get prompted for this fallback option, you must make a selection, either to decline all fallbacks or to select one or both of the options available before you can actually click the Submit button. If you do not, you can't click the Submit button, it's not going to be submitted in the system, and you could be deemed as, to drop out, to decline your commitments and not participate in the auction. So make sure to make a selection there. In general, the Make Commitment screen looks identical for users with a single station or with multiple stations, just that you have more of them. For users with multiple stations, since there are more stations for which a user may commit an initial relinquishment option, the user may need to scroll down the screen to see all of them, but they will be presented on a single screen here. As described earlier, users can choose their preferred option for each station by selecting from a drop-down menu, then clicking the Submit button. This is done individually for each station on your screen. For users with multiple stations, the system displays a notification at the top of the screen showing a count for which of the number of stations for which a user has not yet submitted an initial commitment. This notification will turn green once all of your stations have a submitted commitment. Remember that a user will only see relinquishment options that were selected on the applicant's Form 177 for each station. For example, if an applicant has a station whose pre-auction band is UHF, but for which it selected only the move to low VHF option on its form, that user will only be able to commit to move to low VHF or decline commitment in the auction system. Similarly, if the pre-auction band for a station is low VHF, or in this case high VHF, fewer relinquishment options are available. As a result, a user can only commit to those relinquishment options available for its station. As discussed earlier, if a user chooses as its preferred relinquishment option for a station an option that requires a fallback selection, the user must check the box for one or more fallback options, or check the box to decline all fallback options before it can submit its initial commitment for that station. Once a user has submitted initial commitments for all of its stations, the system will display a notification, as I mentioned before, at the top of the Make Commitment screen. It will turn green. As a reminder, users should print a copy of the screen for their records as a confirmation that all commitments have been successfully submitted. This is what it generally looks like. After the close of the initial commitment window, this screen will once again become unavailable, so users should make sure that they have printed a confirmation of their submission before the window closes. Do I need to repeat that for a third time? Please print your page. It will be very, very useful for you to have a confirmation. Please also note that the auction system will become unavailable shortly after the close of the initial commitment window at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, March 29th. All users that wish to make an initial commitment for their stations and thereby participate in the clock phase of the reverse auction should make sure to submit all commitments for all of their stations by the close of the window. So hopefully you can see that it wasn't actually all that complicated. There's not that much to the system, and even though the concepts might be somewhat a little daunting, actually placing these things and making these commitments is actually quite easy. But to see how we get from the commitments that people submit to setting an initial clearing target and ultimately getting to the clock phase of the reverse auction, I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague Melissa to explain how we get to the clearing target. Or before that, Craig has an announcement.
Hi, I want to update people watching online. The slides are available if you go to www.fcc.gov/events. So once you're at the events page, click on today's event, and the slides will be available there for download. Also, if you're having trouble seeing the streaming video, just try closing your browser and restarting it. And if that doesn't work, try a different browser. We've had some intermittent reports of that problem, but those solutions have worked for us. So again, fcc.gov/events for the slides. And now I'm going to turn it back to Melissa.
Hello. So we have so far talked quite a bit about situations where a station might not be able to be accommodated. What do we mean by that? If a station can't be accommodated, and in what situations does it occur? That's what I'm going to attempt to explain to you and carry on the example that Aaron set up to show you how during the initial commitment period, during the initial clearing target period, the auction system determines the initial options assigned to participating stations and determines if any of those stations cannot be accommodated. Once the initial commitment window closes, the auction system will set an initial clearing target. That's the next step. As part of that process, the system assigns initial options to participating stations. In the bidding procedures PN, we described how mathematical optimization software is used in setting the initial clearing target, and we provided a lot of details about that process. I'm sure you read all of them. I will quickly summarize the process here. The input to the optimization software is the initial commitments made by the participating stations, and it also includes a list of non-participating stations that need to be repacked. The output of the optimization software is an assignment of stations to initial relinquishment options and to provisional channels. The optimization software is run for each of the band plan scenarios. The highest band plan with an assignment that meets the Commission's near nationwide standard for impairments will be the initial clearing target. If a participating station's initial commitment can be accommodated, the station will be assigned an initial option. All other stations will be designated to be repacked in their pre-auction bands and assigned a final channel at the conclusion of the incentive auction. These include non-participating stations, stations that are not needed in the auction, and stations whose initial commitments cannot be accommodated. What do I mean by stations not needed? Well, as part of the process of setting an initial clearing target, the optimization software will determine if there are any participating stations that will always have a feasible channel in their pre-auction band at the initial clearing target or any possible subsequent clearing targets. Any such stations are not needed to participate in the auction, and we will inform an applicant before the clock phase begins if any of its stations fall in this category. So continuing with the small example that Aaron presented earlier, I'm now going to walk you through how the optimization software would assign initial options to those participants in our example. Here we are at where we left off with Aaron. Since the go off air option has unlimited capacity, all the stations that picked go off air as the preferred option will be assigned to that option as their initial option. That's the easy part. Looking at the other two relinquishment option boxes, it gets a bit more complicated. On the right here, we have the participating stations that want to move into the low VHF and high VHF bands as their preferred option. And in the upper left, we have the non-participating stations that must remain broadcasting in those bands. Since the optimization software must ensure that all non-participating stations can continue broadcasting, there may not be many slots available in our move to low VHF and high VHF relinquishment option boxes in the middle. How many participating stations can be initially assigned to those options? And what's the best way to repack the non-participating stations to ensure that the most number of participating stations are accommodated? Well, this is where the optimization software comes into play. There's potentially lots of ways to arrange the stations. So what we do is we provide it goals, and based on the goals, the optimization software determines the best assignment of stations to provisional channels and initial relinquishment options. So let me walk you through those goals that are provided to the optimization software. First, the optimization software will try to minimize the number of participating stations that will not be assigned an initial option. That is, that they will not participate in the auction. We don't like that. We want everybody that wants to participate in the auction to be able to participate. Keep in mind, though, that going off air can always be accommodated. Have we said that a few times? Next, the optimization software will try to assign as many participating stations to their preferred option as possible. If a participating station must be assigned to a fallback option, the optimization software will attempt to assign it to the go off air option if it was selected as a fallback. Why do we give priority to the go off air option as a fallback? Well, because it provides the station with the greatest flexibility to later switch to another relinquishment option it's selected on its Form 177 during the clock phase, based on the bidding hierarchy. We'll talk more about the bidding hierarchy later when we get to the sneak peek of the clock phase bidding software. So coming back to our little example, let's say that the optimization software determined an assignment of participating stations to relinquishment options that looks like this. You will notice that only 2 spots were available in the move to low VHF and move to high VHF relinquishment option boxes. In other words, based on the non-participating stations that will remain broadcasting in those bands, only one of the participating stations that preferred to be assigned to the move to low VHF option could be accommodated. And similarly with the high VHF relinquishment option. The remaining stations whose preferred option could not be accommodated will be designated to be repacked in the pre-auction band, just like this. There they go. And now we arrive at the shining moment of my presentation. Do not be intimidated by the density of the information in this table. It contains the key to all your questions. That is, all your questions about what the possible outcomes could be for your stations based on what you commit to during the initial commitment window. I'll start by breaking down what information is contained in this table, and then I'll go through a few of the scenarios. The first 2 columns show all the possible combinations of initial commitments. The first column shows the 3 possibilities for a preferred option: go off air, move to low V, move to high V. The second column shows all the possible fallback options given the preferred option listed in the first column. The third column lists for each initial commitment combination the order of priority used by the optimization software when determining initial options. And finally, the last column indicates yes or no if at least one of the initial commitment options can always be accommodated. Now let's look at a few of the scenarios. Here we have a go off air as the preferred option. Since it can always be accommodated, a fallback is not applicable. The optimization software will assign the go off air option as the initial option. And so yes, in that scenario, an option can always be accommodated. Next, let's look at a scenario where the preferred option is moved to low VHF. Let me see. I lost my mouse here. Okay. The applicant selected both possible fallback options, go off air and move to high VHF. The optimization software will first attempt to assign that station to its preferred option of move to low VHF. And if that cannot be accommodated, then it will assign it to the go off air option. Because the go off air option was selected as a fallback, at least one option can always be accommodated in this scenario. Moving on to a preferred option to move to high VHF. Let's say in this scenario that the applicant only selected move to low VHF as a fallback. When the optimization software is determining the initial option for this station, it will first attempt to assign that station to the move to high VHF relinquishment option. If that cannot be accommodated, second, it will try to move it to the low VHF relinquishment option. And if that cannot be accommodated, finally, it will designate it to be repacked in its pre-auction band. So in this case, it's not always possible for an option to be accommodated. Last example here, an applicant that selected move to high VHF declined to make any fallbacks. During the initial clearing target, the optimization software attempts to assign that station to move to high VHF. If it cannot be accommodated, the station will be designated to be repacked. And so, again, in this case, an option cannot always be accommodated. So to summarize, if a participating station is needed in the auction and selects the go off air option as either its preferred option or a fallback option, it will be in the auction, guaranteed. If a participating station is needed in the auction and only selects moving to one of the VHF bands as its preferred option, and either declines to select fallback options or selects moving to the other VHF band as a fallback option, it may be repacked in its pre-auction band and therefore may not be in the auction. With that, we're going to have a short break. And when we return, we will answer questions received that you have about the presentation so far. If you haven't submitted questions yet, please do so now. And I'm going to turn it over back to Craig for any further instructions, or no? When do we come back from break? About 20 minutes. 20 minutes. We'll come back and we'll have a panel up here to answer any of your questions, so make sure you get your questions in. Thank you. Yeah, after the question and answers, the sneak peek into the clock phase software. Yeah.
Oh, we never. Okay, we're going to start with our question and answer session in just a moment. If everyone could get settled. Yeah, we need everybody for the question and answer session. Okay, we have Gary, who's the chair of the Incentive Auction Task Force, Howard, the vice chair, Margie, the division chief of the Auctions and Spectrum Access Division, and then Melissa, John, and Aaron from the Incentive Auction Task Force. Take it away.
Thank you, Craig, and welcome back, everybody. We're going to go through the questions now, and we'll follow that with a sneak peek by Melissa of the reverse auction bidding software. But let's first go to everyone's questions. A couple of preliminary remarks first. We did get a number of questions regarding the reverse auction bidding. I'm going to defer those questions for Melissa's sneak peek, and we will be back to you as we get closer to the reverse auction clock phase for additional training opportunities, and I think we'll be able to address those questions then. Let me just cover a couple of miscellaneous questions. First, one question Are we going to release a list of forward auction applicants? Answer is yes. We do that in each auction. We put out what we call a status public notice. That is a list of all the applicants with the status of their application. We'll be doing that here as well in reasonably short order. Another question was whether a bidder whose option is not accepted or who drops out of the auction will be protected in accordance with our rules protecting a population and coverage area. The answer to that is yes, that's true. Whether you are dropping out and staying in your home band, your pre-auction band, or whether you're actually a winning bidder moving from UHF to VHF, your population and coverage area will be protected in accordance with our rules. There may have been some confusion. Your bid may not be accepted, but that doesn't mean you don't get the protection of our rules for your population and coverage area. We also got a question about the prohibited communication rules. That could be a webinar in and of itself. So I would ask the person who posed that question to reach out to us, and we're happy to sit down with you and walk through those rules. With that, I have the easy task now of deferring to my panelists for questions, and we'll start with Erin.
So I'm primarily going to answer some logistics questions for you. We had lots of logistic questions, which the first one, and probably the most important one on everyone's minds right now as they're anxiously awaiting the status of their applications, is when are we going to mail the second confidential status letter? We plan to send that letter sometime next week. And that letter will include the RSA token information, the password, the login information, and all of those things that you need to be able to make your initial commitment. The letter will be mailed to the contact that is in the Form 177. So whatever address is in there for your contact person is the address we will mail the letter to. If you need that address to change, then by all means, please update that as soon as possible. And please remember that this time around, someone must sign for the letter in order for the package to be delivered so that we get a confirmation of delivery. So again, make sure you're comfortable with where that package is going to be sent. Another person asked how and when a licensee may be informed that its station is not needed. That information will be in the second confidential status letter. That letter will tell you the status of the application, whether the application and stations are qualified to participate in the clock rounds. So it'll either say that the station is qualified, the station is not qualified because it was not needed, or that it was not qualified because the initial commitment could not be accommodated, or it could potentially be not qualified because no commitment was made. Additionally, someone else asked if someone has determined that they do not want to offer the station in the auction, can they withdraw their application? You may not withdraw the application. However, you can always decline to make an initial commitment, in which case you again will not be qualified, and you will that station that you did not make a commitment for will be designated for repacking in its pre-auction band. Finally, someone asked, what if there's a medical emergency or some other thing that comes up during these, days where you're going to be having to make these bids? This is why we allow applicants to designate up to 3 authorized bidders. So we suggest very strongly that you have at least 2 authorized bidders. So if something happens to one person, another person will be ready to step in and make those bids. And with that, I will turn it over to Margie.
Hi, thanks for your questions. So I have, just to repeat, I got some of the some different logistics questions, including questions about when the tokens will be sent, and it will be sent, as Erin said, in the package next week with second confidential status letters. I got some other questions about tokens and authorized bidders, including a question about whether tokens are user-specific. If you have 3 bidders, can they each select a token? The tokens will be assigned to a specific user as identified on the applicant's Form 177. Each token has its own serial number, and that will be assigned to a specific name. Somebody else asked, can the same PIN number be used for all 3 secure IDs? You can pick whatever, each authorized bidder can pick whatever PIN they want to use. As we say in all our auctions, bidders are responsible for their own, watching out for their own security of their end of the bidding, and so just consider whatever security concerns you may have. And finally, not finally, but the next one is for companies with multiple licensed entities, will it be possible to log in and see all your, I'm not sure, screens at once? No, each token is associated with the FRN used on an application. So each token will bring up the licenses that were on a specific application associated with a specific FRN and specific group of stations selected. Let's see. Then somebody else asked about the steps for logging in and for making an initial commitment telephonically. When you use telephonic bidding, you must have an authorized bidder, user ID, password, just as if you were logging into the computer yourself. The number where you call if you want to use telephonic bidding will be in the letter that in the package that you get with the second confidential status letter. Telephonic bid assistants are scripted. So when bidders bid telephonically, they need to assure that they have left adequate time for the telephonic bid assistant to get through the script and ask all the questions and confirm that everything is right. And then I have a few other questions about later phase. When will the clock phase start? And just what happens later. I'll just go into those briefly. Before the clock phase can start, we have to have initial commitments. We have to set the initial clearing target. That's going to be 3 to 4 weeks after the initial commitment deadline. Shortly after that, there will be mock auction so that every qualified bidder has an opportunity to actually get in and log into the real system and see how it works. And shortly after that, the clock phase will start. So we don't have those specific dates, but that's the general timeline. And Melissa.
How and when does the system determine if a participating station is needed in the auction? Well, the when is during the initial clearing target optimization process. Okay, so as soon as initial commitments are finished, we start that process of setting the initial clearing target. And part of that process is determining the stations that are not needed. How it does it is through math optimization software. And the details of that optimization are in the technical appendices. I can't remember which letter. No, the station's not needed. F? It's one of the technical appendices in the applications procedures PM.
Something like that.
One of them. It's clearly marked as, how the system determines stations not needed. All the details of the mathematical optimizations used to do that and the process are in that appendix. If a station selects go off air, is it automatically in the auction or is there another threshold to be passed? Well, the other threshold is if the station's needed. So even if you select go off air as your preferred option, if that station is not needed in the auction, then it won't be in the auction. Can a station have a preferred option of go off air and a fallback option of move to high VHF? The answer is no, because it's not necessary. If your preferred option is go off air, that's what you'll be assigned. That was the first line in the scenario here. If a bidder selects multiple fallback options, how will the system determine which option to process first? Key to my presentation, right? The answers are here. So that's the third column here, the rank order of how the priority that the optimization software uses. How are fallback commitments ranked? In other words, if I choose both fallback options, will the low VHF option always be considered by the software before the off-air option? As we talked about, the off-air option will always be preferred as a fallback. Given guaranteed to play if I choose the off-air selection, what is the worst case scenario for this choice? I guess if you want to go off-air, the worst case scenario would be that you're not needed in the auction. Another possibility would be that the price gets too low in the clock phase and you're not willing to pay to go off-air for that price, and so you drop out. And then John.
All right, thanks, Melissa. So one of the questions we got was if a station no longer wants to participate in the auction by the time the initial commitment window opens, does a station have to select decline to commit, or can it just do nothing, i.e. not select commitments during the window? As mentioned earlier, if you do not affirmatively click submit for a commitment, when the window closes, that's treated as if you've declined to make a commitment. And so in this case, you can either select decline and click submit or not submit anything. It's the same thing in the system. Here's a two-part thing. Can we get an audio file of the presentation? That'll be in a couple of business days. This will be available. Recording of the presentation will be available on the FCC's website. And then the second part is, can two computers be logged into the same commitment profile concurrently, i.e. the station logs into commitment profile with computer 1 and computer 2, each computer having different providers? If you are logging in with the same username and token, no. Only one browser can be logged in for one bidder, authorized bidder at the same time. However, if you have multiple users, multiple tokens, they can all be logged in for the same applicant at the same time. So keep that in mind. Don't step on each other's toes if you're both trying to submit something for one station. So this is a question about the messages. Who are we sending these to? Are these the same individuals who answer support phone line calls? We'll be sending them to the FCC staff generally, and we will be routing these to the appropriate locations. If there's anything that's extremely time sensitive, we encourage you. There'll be an indication, and also in your letter you'll be receiving a telephone number to call for the bidder support line. You should, if there's a very pressing matter, contact them. But what level of support can we expect from the internal message system? We will get to these as soon as we can, and we will have people during business hours staffing the whole system, so we should be able to get to them quickly. But if it's particularly time sensitive, please call the number. All right, so somebody asked about once the form has been completed and a second status letter has been signed and returned, my application is complete. Once the auction begins, if there are no changes needed to my form, will I need to log into the system for anything other than monitoring the progress of the auction? In other words, does the applicant need to be prepared to have someone monitor the process for any last-minute questions? If I understand this correctly, I think they're asking about the different system for applications and for the bidding system, and they will be different URLs, different systems entirely, and my understanding is that they shouldn't need to do anything with their applications, but maybe Aaron would know better.
We have a requirement that you update your Form 177 if you have any minor modifications or changes in ownership or the types of information that you have an ongoing obligation to update. Other than that, you won't need to log back into the Form 177 once this process is done.
All right, and one final question. If we understand, a station may use a preferred option as move to low VHF and as a fallback to go off air. Yes, if your station, either a UHF station or a high VHF station, selected those two options on at least those two options on the form, the station can choose to move to low V, and if low V cannot be accommodated, there's not enough channels available there during the optimization, the fallback will be to go off air, and that will be considered instead. That's all I got.
Thank you all. To those of you out in the audience who were providing questions to us while we were up here, We will get back to you with answers, and of course, we remain available for questions as we move forward to March 29th and beyond. The web address, I guess, for this auction will be auctions1001@fcc.gov. So please feel free to reach out to us if you have additional questions. And with that, we will turn it over to Melissa for the sneak peek at the reverse auctions of the reverse auction software. And it is a sneak peek, so it'll be pretty brief, just to give you a little taste of what we'll be seeing in more detail in the coming weeks.
Let's see. All right, here we go. Reverse auction clock phase. In this last presentation of the day, I'm going to briefly go over what happens from setting the initial clearing target to the start of bidding in the clock phase. I'll also give a brief review of the bidding hierarchy and provide a few examples of how it applies in the clock phase. And we got several questions about that. Finally, we'll take a sneak peek of the bidding software that will be used during the clock phase. After the initial clearing target is set, applicants that were permitted to make an initial commitment will be sent a final confidential status letter, as we've mentioned, informing them whether they have become qualified to bid in the clock phase of the reverse auction. An applicant's station could be deemed not qualified if the applicant did not make an initial commitment for this station, or if the auction system determined that the station is not needed, or finally, if the station was unassigned because it was assigned to be repacked in its pre-auction band in the initial assignment because its initial commitment could not be accommodated. So there's 3 reasons that a station might be not qualified. As Margie mentioned, soon after the final confidential status letter, we will have a mock auction. With the mock auction will come a lot of training materials, as we did with initial commitment. There will be a user guide, there will be an online tutorial, and then the mock auction provides an opportunity for you to have hands-on experience with the software before we go into the clock phase. And we'll also have training on the software before the mock auction. More details about the mock auction will be provided in your final confidential letter. After the mock auction comes the actual bidding in the clock phase. This is where the initial option kicks in. Each station that becomes qualified to bid in the clock phase will begin the clock phase bidding for its assigned initial option. In round 1, a lower price will be offered to each station to relinquish its spectrum usage rights associated with its initial option, unless that station is frozen. So, it's possible that you could start the auction out as frozen. And we're not going to go into the details of what does frozen mean. We explained that in the bidding procedures PN, but we will have a lot of training about that coming up before we get to the reverse auction. If a station is not frozen, in round 1 you'll be offered a lower price for the initial relinquishment option that you were assigned during the initial clearing target optimization process. Each station will also be given price offers for other relinquishment options as applicable for that station. We're going to talk about that. So where does the bidding hierarchy fit in? The bidding hierarchy only applies to bidding in the clock phase, since it's applicable only once a station has been assigned to an initial option. In other words, the initial option determines where you start on the hierarchy. Once you're on the hierarchy, you can only move in one direction as shown in the chart. Across the top, we show for each of the different bands. On the left is the different relinquishment options. Your initial option tells you where you start. And from that starting point, during the clock phase, you can only move in the direction of the hierarchy. Let's review some of the rules that apply to the relinquish options and the bid hierarchy, and then I'm going to go through a few really quick examples to illustrate the rules. Once a station is assigned an initial option, it can only switch to relinquishment options based on the bidding hierarchy and the options selected on Form 177 during the clock phase. In other words, let me say that in the reverse order. During the clock phase, the only options that you can move to or switch your held option to are options that are allowable by the bid hierarchy, and it also has to be an option that you selected on your form. A station will only be given price offers for relinquishment options selected on Form 177. If a relinquishment option is no longer available to a station because of the bidding hierarchy, it will no longer be given price offers for that option, even if it selected that option in the form. So let's walk through some examples. We're back to our boxes. Let's take a UHF station as an example, and let's say that this station selected all options on Form 177. During the initial commitment period, it committed as a preferred option to move to low VHF. It selected fallbacks of go off air and move to high V. We're going to consider two scenarios for this station. Scenario 1, the station is assigned as its initial option, move to low VHF. There it is in the box. At the start of the clock phase, this station will be given price offers to stay in low VHF or move to high VHF. The station will not be given price offers to go off air during the clock phase due to the bidding hierarchy. Let's look at the other scenario. Another scenario. Instead of getting its preferred option of move to low VHF, let's say the station is assigned go off air as its initial option. At the start of the clock phase, the station will be given price offers for all relinquishment options. Remember, because it's not only because it's available in the hierarchy, but because it selected those options on its form. Another example. Again, a UHF station. Again, they selected all the options on their Form 177. In the initial commitment period, they selected move to high VHF as their preferred option, and they selected both available fallback options. Let's say their initial assignment, or their initial option assigned to them is the move to high VHF option. Because of the bidding hierarchy, during the clock phase, this station will not be able to select go off air or move to low V relinquishment options. Make sense? Consequently, the station will only be given price offers to stay in the high VHF relinquishment option during the clock phase. So the boxes are in the order of the hierarchy. Example number 3. A UHF station that only selected go off air on its Form 177. During the initial commitment period, it committed to that option of go off air, and it was assigned to the go off air option. During the clock phase, the station will only be given price offers for going off air because it didn't select the other options on its Form 177. Even though, according to the bid hierarchy, it would be allowed, it didn't select it as an option that it wanted to be given price offers for in the clock phase. So hopefully that addressed a lot of your questions that we had about the clock phase. A lot of them had to do with the bid hierarchy. Again, we're going to have a lot more training on this as we get closer to the clock phase. We don't want to confuse you too much with initial commitments and bid hierarchies. Remember, the bid hierarchy kicks in once you've been assigned an initial option, and it applies to the clock phase. But it's important to keep it in mind because the initial commitments are informing us where you want to start at the beginning of the clock phase. So here we go with our sneak peek. The login process for the clock phase of the reverse auction is exactly the same as the initial commitment login. You're going to use your same username, your same tokens, everything. So don't lose those tokens. After the initial commitment period, put them someplace safe. Once the system is available, as with initial commitments, there will be a link that will be posted on this page, and you will be able to get to the software. Look familiar? The navigation is identical to the initial commitment software. The only thing that has changed is there's some additional screens that are available on the left. The station info page is exactly the same as you saw it on the initial commitment software. The only difference is the opening prices are not shown as they're no longer applicable. These are, again, it shows your options that you selected on the form on this page. The auction schedule screen shows the schedule for upcoming bidding rounds during the auction. For each round, the screen displays the round number, the duration of the round, the start time in Eastern Time, and the end time. The My Results screen will be available before bidding in round 1 begins, and it will show you the results of the initial clearing target optimization. In other words, you will come to this page to see what your initial option is that you've been assigned. Well, let me back up there. So on the screen you can see for this station, it has a status in green of bidding, and next to it you'll see its initial option at the start of stage 1. And in this example it was to go off air, and that's the opening price in this illustrative example. On the place bid screen, when a round is open, bidding will be available. When a round is not open, bidding is not available on the screen, and you'll see a banner that says that the round is not yet open. At the top, a box indicates that all stations have unsubmitted bids when the round opens. The place bid screen will display all of a bidder's stations, just as it did in the initial commitment software. For each station, a bidder can see its currently held option. And in this case of round 1 that we're showing in our example, the currently held option is your initial option, as it was assigned during the process of determining initial clearing target. The bidder can select its preferred bid option for the current round. So round 1 opens, you'll see a drop-down that says select your preferred option. For each station, a bidder selects its preferred bid option from a drop-down menu. A bidder can select, first option is to stay in its currently held option at the new clock price. So this is what I was talking about. You will be given a price offer for your initial held option at a lower price in round 1. So option 1 is you can stay in your current option. You will also be given, if available, the opportunity to switch to an option that you selected on Form 177 if it's available based on the bid hierarchy. Remember our examples. So if it's available and you selected it on your form, you will see it in the drop-down menu, and you have the option to change your preferred option to move to one of the VHF bands. You'll also always have the option to drop out of bidding if you no longer want to keep this station in the auction. If a bidder selects as its preferred option to stay in its currently held option, it can also submit proxy bid instructions. I'm not going to go into the details of that here in the sneak peek, but we will give you lots of information later about how that's done. If a bidder chooses to switch its preferred option to a VHF band, the system will prompt the bidder to select a fallback option. If the system cannot accommodate the bidder's preferred option, its selected fallback option will be processed. During the clock phase, the fallback options are a little simpler. You have the option of staying in your currently held option for the clock price for that round, or to drop out of bidding. So your preferred is to move to a VHF band. If that can't be accommodated, you tell us, do you want to stay in the auction at your current option, in your currently held relinquishment option, or if it can't be accommodated, do you want to drop out of the auction? And you select one of those two options. To submit a bid, the bidder selects its preferred option and fallback option if applicable, and clicks on the Submit button. If a bid has not been submitted, when the round closes, the system will automatically consider the preferred option for that station to be a bid to drop out of the auction. So if you don't come in and effectively submit a bid or have a proxy submit a bid for you, the system will automatically drop you out of the auction. Well, I guess unless you're frozen. The system will indicate whether a bid has been successfully submitted. On the bid summary screen, you'll see a display of the bids and the proxy instructions submitted by a bidder in a round. Once bid processing is complete for a round, the results will be posted on the My Results page. So in this example now, you're seeing the results from round 1. Finally, on the download screen, a bidder can download a summary of the bids submitted in each round, the bidding results for each round, and information about its stations. If you have any further questions, here's a list of contact information. And I guess we're done for the day. Oh, Gary wants to say a few things.
Just say 3 or 4 simple things. One of them, the most important, is thanks to the team for the great work that they have done and will do. Even what Melissa went through is important because it will inform your initial commitment. But focus, for us anyway, is between now and March 29th on the initial commitment bids. Second thing I want to say is, for the sake of completeness and because you have the option to do it, we have gone through fallbacks and bidder commitments and all of those variations. They're mostly for folks who want to have the option of flexibility of moving to VHF, either high V or low V. If you don't do that, if you're a UHF station who either wants in or out, about 80% of this goes away. And it's just a much simpler system all the way around. But we encourage those options. We want you to consider them. And some of the complexity that was introduced is directly as a result of that, and it's important. The third thing is there were some good questions about not needed, and let me just explain that again for a second. In the initial, in the opening bid commitments, which we publicly made available, they were a set of not needed stations. Those are stations which aren't needed at any of the adopted initial clearing targets from 128 on down. When we get your bid commitments in, okay, on March 29th, there will be a second round of stations since we will now know who's in the auction. And so those are the second round of not needed stations, which we will inform on a confidential basis in a letter of those stations. So that's how the two things relate to it. And the third and the fourth and final thing is we hope to see you all committing successfully on March 29th. And thank you very much. Thanks.